Thank you so much for coming. I think there's really only one thing to say by way of kicking this off, which is that, Brian, you have done this amazing thing, which is that you have written this vivid, deeply felt, deeply alive, very timely book about New York City. And so will you please start us off by reading a little bit from it?
Okay. So I guess I should you know what, before I do, this is like the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my whole life. I forgive like a minute of inarticulate gratitude, but I like it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen, seeing all these people in a room. I've spent so many years trying to do this, and as a lot of you have known, the last year and a half or so has been not the easiest, and I am so touched and overwhelmed by all of you being here. It really is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. So, thank you. The other thing I just realized, looking at a room full of former students and my grandmother and the rabbi who bar mitzvahed me, was that wasn't like at the forefront of my mind when I chose what section I was going to read. So if you hear something that sounds like pouring a funnel full of vodka into somebody's asshole, that's what it is. You're hearing right. Montecille, I love you. And I will beg for your forgiveness after. But what the hell? Here we go. Oh, right. So I'm going to read a little bit, not a lot, just a little bit, because there are some standing uncomfortable people. But what we're going to do is I'm going to do a little bit from one of the protagonists' perspective and then a little bit from another one. The first one, his name is Aaron. He is a gentrifier. He used to be a rabbi, but as I guess happens, he was a gambling addict who didn't believe in God, so that got hard for him. And he started a new life using the gambling skills on Wall Street to make some money and to afford a new beautiful house in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, where I live, on the block where I live with people similar to those people I interact with, but who are not you. There's nobody in this room, in other rooms, at the Greenlight event maybe, but none of you are in this book. Also important for you to know that. So the first character is this guy, Aaron, a gentrifying man who has a gentrifying girlfriend and a gentrifying baby, and they live in Bed-Stuy and are trying to make it work. The second part that I'm going to read is from the perspective of Sarah, who is a local 18-year-old girl. She's been living in the neighborhood forever. And I'm going to give you a little bit from her perspective as sort of the chaos starts to build. Then we'll chat for a bit, and then you can yell at me about stuff. But mostly, thank you. This is really nice. There were trees on both sides of the street, tall trees starting to lose their leaves. It was a crisp, cloudless September day. Similar skies had framed the World Trade Center. A member of his congregation had worked at Cantor Fitzgerald, and even as late as 2008, Aaron had been shy in the presence of the man's widow and 3 teenage daughters. Aaron and Amelia's house was 383 Stuyvesant Avenue. A little cafe had opened just around the corner on Decatur, and on the way to the subway, women in elegant leather boots sipped tiny paper cups of espresso. Black women in high boots, white women in boots, Asian women, all with their tiny paper cups. Men, too. Stylish black men in trench coats, white men in sweaters, jeans, and sports coats. There had been tension lately between the police and members of the community, men and women of all races staring down police officers on the way into the subway, which would now be exacerbated by what had happened on Saturday. Jason Blau had only been 12, a large 12, in 7th grade and on the JV high school football team Aaron had read, but still only 12. What a catastrophe for the police, for his family, and for the community. But that type of thing was, if nauseating, not unheard of for changing neighborhoods. There was still paradise here, and Aaron was in on it. He'd bought the house because it was beautiful and he wanted to spend his life there with Amelia and one day children, but he'd already earned 35% back on investment in just over a year. Bed-Stuy was the best bet he'd ever made. It was a real risk and a thrilling one. It took guts to be surrounded by people who didn't look like him in a neighborhood without the amenities he was accustomed to. But it was worth it. As long as New York City remained desirable and Manhattan stayed an island without extra available real estate, the only way he could lose was a spike in crime to scare off new gentrifiers. Across the street from Aaron's row of brownstones were, unusually for Brooklyn, 3 large standalone homes. 2 could be considered mansions, the third a church. It was 7:30 and the church's chimes were ringing. Walking in step with the chimes, away from his pretty girlfriend and son who knew how to laugh. I forgot to tell you, Aaron's son knows how to laugh. We find that out previously. Walking away from them, Aaron felt like a man. It was a feeling he relished, one he hadn't known if he'd ever feel again. He was a man with a house and a job and a son and what was essentially a wife. On good days, that was enough to feel connected to the world. He passed 385 Stuyvesant Avenue, bought just a few months earlier by a young couple who both earned in the high 6 figures. The man and woman had met at a historically black college and now worked in finance. She'd gone to Stanford Business. He'd gone to Harvard Law, where he'd apparently traveled in the same circle as a bunch of men and women who would later become friends with Michelle Obama. Then 387, which belonged to Mr. Jupiter, a 40-year-old single father and electrician. You know what kids are doing these days, Mr. Jupiter said. What's that, Aaron said, not wanting to offend him or answer incorrectly. Last time they'd talked, Jupiter had told Aaron to buy new windows before the winter, and Aaron couldn't tell if he was angling for the job. Well, you know about breathalyzer tests, right? Uh-huh. Well, kids have been pouring liquor right inside their assholes, Jupiter said. Cops don't go around smelling assholes, and it enters the bloodstreams quicker. That true? Aaron laughed. I thought you'd get a kick out of that, Jupiter said, but it's serious and dangerous. They take their bottles of vodka and pour the whole thing right into each other's assholes with funnels. That's what my son's been caught doing. I saw him do it, him and his friends, all bent over with their trousers down around their ankles. So that's the first part. I realize now I just could have stopped reading, but before that was totally unnecessary. Chapter 19. Sarah acted like she was tired of people thinking she was a boy and then being surprised when they realized she was a girl, but everyone knew that she liked surprising people. Sarah was 18 and looked younger when she woke up in the morning, was just out of the shower. When she was in her sweatpants and a big hoodie and a baseball cap and sunglasses like she was now, she looked older than 18, and she looked like a boy. And it wasn't some accidental thing. She liked the way she looked. The girls she was into liked the way she looked. That was half the point of dressing that way. And Sarah liked getting mad when people didn't know she was a girl. Sarah and her last girlfriend had fought. They never really talked about why, but they fought a lot, and they fought in public, and usually it was Sarah who threw her girlfriend up against a fence, or down to the sidewalk, or against lampposts, or Fulton and Albany. Her girlfriend was dumb as shit, but she looked good. She was skinny, but she had a body on her. Even when it was cold outside, she showed it off. People like to stop their car and yell out, "You don't put your hands to a woman like that." And what if someone pushed your mom or sister? And with her girlfriend halfway down the block by then, Sarah stood up straight and strong and said, "I am a woman, you bitch. I am a woman. You want to call the cops? You call the fucking cops," which almost made that car, almost always, made it drive away. Then Sarah caught back up to her dumb, pretty girlfriend and apologized and kissed wherever she'd made her hurt and took her home to either one of their mom's places. And because neither Sarah nor her girlfriend had jobs, and both of them had police records and were over 18, so they weren't allowed back into Boys and Girls High to finish off their degrees, they spent the afternoons getting food or smoking in bed. But now it was hot out. Sarah was in handcuffs, and she didn't have a girlfriend anymore. Sarah had purposefully broken the law to get arrested, but now that she was arrested, she wasn't sure what was supposed to happen next. She was angry. Everyone sitting on that curb was angry. Angry about Jason, even though she didn't really know the kid, and from what she'd heard, people who did know him didn't really like him, but about how there was nothing to do about him getting killed. Getting arrested had sounded like a protest, but it was dumb. And now her mom was going to kick her out because she'd been arrested again, this time for nothing. She had, along with a couple others, jumped a turnstile, stopped, frisked, arrested, and then marched upstairs to sit in Fulton Park. That was new and racist. Usually they just stop and frisk and maybe arrest you, but the march upstairs had never happened before to her or anyone she knew. Though now she saw why they'd taken her to the park. Too many people were getting arrested. The police must not know what to do with all of them. There were 20 of them rounded up around the Utica subway station, right by Boys and Girls High. Another 30 or so were being brought to where the 12 of them were. The cops seemed tired of arresting them, but every 10 minutes it was like another group of everyone she knew was being rounded up and brought outside Boys and Girls High, which was where she would have liked to get her degree from anyway if she'd been allowed. Sarah and close to 50 others stood around for a while, but it was too hot to keep them all there in cuffs. The cuffs themselves were heating up on her wrists and nearly cutting through, and it was embarrassing, even if they'd done it on purpose. It was all so dumb. Fare evasion in front of a cop, shoplifting in front of a cop, spitting at a cop, threatening a cop. Sarah still knew a lot of the kids up in the classrooms who were looking down at her. She'd been in those classrooms 18 months earlier. She'd never been a great student, but one time in 8th grade, the English teacher had them act out a scene from To Kill a Mockingbird, which was still her favorite book. And she and her friend Stace had done this whole speech about how the slave couldn't have done it because there were no witnesses and no motive. And even though the teacher was going to rule on the other side, he said that because she and Stace did such a convincing job, he ruled on their side instead. He even said that they could be lawyers if they wanted to. And because everyone knew back then that Stace was going to be some fat piece of shit whore, the teacher must have meant Sarah could be a lawyer. That was only 4 years ago. It made Sarah want to cry right there in cuffs on the street.
So part of what I thought was so striking about your book is that there are some really vivid human characters, like the ones you just described and read about. But there's kind of this dominant character that is the neighborhood, right? Bed-Stuy is, you could argue, the leading character in your book. And it made me think about how, especially as New Yorkers, our neighborhoods are like characters, right? We think we know them, then they change on us. They have their familiar curves, and yet they surprise us. Tell us about your Bed-Stuy, because clearly something about the real Bed-Stuy inspired you to write this book.
Sure thing. And it's not only something about the real Bed-Stuy, but I tried to keep as many real elements in the book as possible. You know, it takes place at a real Fulton Park near the real A&C train. You know, Boys and Girls High School is right above that park. The streets are really the streets' names. I felt that I wanted to keep it as vivid and as real as possible as I was inventing these characters. Alex and I moved to Bed-Stuy 7 years ago or so because we were excited by the possibility of affording a big, beautiful house where we could start raising kids. I super naively didn't think about the rest of it, really. I mean, we had been in Clinton Hill before, which was still then a majority African-American neighborhood, and we were comfortable there, and it was fine. And then we moved into Bed-Stuy. But the experience of buying and of being the first non-African-Americans on the block was obviously complicated in a way that I hadn't anticipated. I think initially our neighbors were a little bit skeptical of us. Like, I think 3 different neighbors made the, we're happy to have some diversity on the block joke, which, isn't really a joke, you know? So, the fact that 3 of them said that identically, made it clear that they were all having this conversation, you know, behind our backs and, trying to figure out who and what we were. And that all changed when everyone realized that like we were there to stay and to raise a family. And I think when they saw pregnant Alex beautifully wobbling around and having like being able to touch the kid that was going to be and talk to us about raising kids, and then a couple of our neighbors had kids and we raised them alongside them, that everyone realized that like we were going to be there for the rest of our lives. And we got mostly, not mostly, we got exclusively the most extraordinarily generous, warm welcome you could imagine. But it wasn't perfect. It started to be clear that behind the thrill of being welcomed into a neighborhood. I mean, I'd never been in a neighborhood before. We grew up on Broadway, just north of 4th Street, and there were some neighbors, but being part of a neighborhood was such a thrill that I think it took me a little bit longer to see the rest of what was going on and what it meant that we and people like us were coming into the neighborhood. I'd say 3 or 4 out of 5 days a week. In the first couple of years at least, we saw, a handful of African-American teenagers handcuffed and pressed up against that grate that separates the stairs up to the street from down to the sidewalk. And I just remember thinking, like, this is terrible. Like, there are totally reasonable debates on both sides of whether stop and frisk actually was to be credited for reducing gun violence and crime and all that, but the lived experience of it was just so obviously miserable for everybody involved that the kids were humiliated, the cops seemed to be stoically doing their job but clearly weren't happy about it, and the commuters for whom all of this was ostensibly done, we all were sort of looking at each other with this feeling of impotence every day, feeling that like this isn't a good way to start anybody's day. And I began to imagine like what would happen if things ratcheted up a little bit, like if there was an added element of tension into those scenes. And that was really the origin of what made me start thinking about writing a book where all these various people, all kind and looking out for their families and themselves, can be at cross purposes, when there is that kind of tension.
Right, and that is the book, right? The book is called Bed-Stuy Is Burning, and the book is sort of like, okay, what if you took the racial and economic tensions that many of us see evidence of every day, but what if you took them to their end terminus, right? What if you followed the rope of all of those tensions to the worst possible place? Have you seen evidence of that in real life in Bed-Stuy? And even if you did, how did you get from there to the fictional boiling point that you describe in the book?
Right. I saw softer versions of that. I saw regularly very angry people who were clearly doing their best to stifle that anger. I mean, the one side of the frustrations is the stop and frisk and that kind of aggressive policing changing the way people live. And that goes hand in hand with gentrification because these neighborhoods were not as tightly policed, until people with more influence and economic visibility came into the neighborhood. But the other side of that is, I was saying we have great relationships with the owners on our block. And although, of course, they're complicated and historically varied, in terms of who's there at the moment and the degree to which we hang out with them. But we come in, we raise property value for people who own the houses there. Amenities follow us. I mean, it's all of what is, classically considered the benefits of gentrification, but it's a tiny group of people who are really able to take advantage of those benefits. So I mentioned the tensions and anger that I saw sort of most vividly in the subways, where kids are screaming at cops and cops are threatening violence and kids are saying, what, you're going to shoot me? And, they never did, but sort of the imagination, prescribes what could happen. But on the other side of that, you have the majority of residents of Bed-Stuy who aren't owners, who rent, and whose lives are uprooted because people like us move in. You know, all of a sudden, rents skyrocket. They need to be displaced. They are forced to leave communities that not only have they been in their whole lives, but where all their friends are and where their family is. And a few times, especially in the early days, people stopped me on the street and said, you know, I'll choose this opportunity not to curse. Do you think you're doing here? Like this isn't for you. You know, we've had decades of people not picking up the trash and policing not being acceptable and sort of all these municipal problems which are now solved. So like, you get to live here now, you want to live here, you're discovering this, and it makes so much sense. I mean, right now Bed-Stuy is the neighborhood in New York with the most homelessness. You see people moving out in droves from Bed-Stuy to East New York and Brownsville and out into Queens. So the tensions that I saw rarely rose to the area of violence. I saw, you know, a few times kids on bikes run by and steal an iPhone and push somebody down and use some angry epithets, but it never got to the degree that it got here. But as I was writing this, I mean, I started this 7-8 years ago, but as I was writing this, you know, I was obviously paying close attention to what was happening in Ferguson and Baltimore and Cleveland and seeing a kind of worst case scenario, well, probably not worst case scenario, but horrible case scenario play out as I was trying to imagine the implications of what would happen in my neighborhood. And those communities are unique. I mean, they're different from one another is what I'm trying to say. And their issues aren't necessarily ours, but the tension is, and feeling that escalating tension in Bed-Stuy when the race riots, which I think is the right word for it, civil unrest if you want to call it that, but I mean, cops shot African Americans and African Americans decided that they'd had enough. While that was occurring across the country, I was trying to figure out how that would all play out around me.
So I want to ask you to read just one more paragraph, and then
For
I
sure.
have a question about it. I can hand you my copy.
Great.
Will you read that second paragraph on page 206?
Also, who the fuck did these white Wall Street assholes think they were? Buying up one of the nicer homes in the community that had been all black and suffering and oppressed for 75 years. It just seems so douchey. Oh, so this is from the perspective of a white tenant in the home of Aaron and Amelia. It all seems so douchey. White people kept their neighborhood poor and crappy for 3/4 of a century, and then as soon as black people worked to make it a more pleasant place to live, this white couple came in and bought the nice house. Granted, it wasn't like Aaron and Amelia were the individuals who'd been oppressing the people in the neighborhood, and granted, the people they brought the place from made out well, and the house itself was beautiful, and Aaron and Amelia had the money and therefore shouldn't be forbidden from living in any house they wanted in any neighborhood in any city. But come on, they had to walk into the definitive historical district in the blackest neighborhood in the country and buy the house on the block and then not even rent to black people? Fuck them. It just seemed like such a piece of shit move.
So here's my question. I think in what you said before you read that, and do you want to say something?
That's just like not what the book is. It's full of polite people being generous with one another. These are the three passages.
But no, I don't want you to justify anything, because the reason I asked you to read that is because I thought it really captured the tensions of gentrification. And what I wanted to ask you is, before you read, you spoke very eloquently about the kind of dilemmas and guilt and irreconcilable situation of gentrification. And I also thought that paragraph captured it beautifully. But my question is, do people actually talk about this in real life in Bed-Stuy? And do they speak about it with one another across racial and economic barriers? Or did you, in some sense, as a novelist, have to write this book so you could talk about it and talk to other people and talk to strangers, and hopefully strangers with different backgrounds of yours?
It's a great question, because I did both. did a series of formal interviews with local high school kids, with police officers in the neighborhood, with business owners and construction workers, and there was that element of it. But also, I lucked into having hundreds of hours of casual conversations with my friends and neighbors. And for the first year or so, there were no mentions of any of this, and I think that allowed me to continue being naive in a way, where people were very polite and came over and we talked about sports, essentially. A couple years in, once they realized that we were real human beings who were going to be in their lives for a while, African American neighbors started having conversations first with us and then in front of us in a truly enlightening way that made me seem like less of a cultural tourist to write in the way that I did from people's perspectives. I think, to answer your question one step further, I think black people are having these conversations constantly. I think white people, for the most part, struggle with the vocabulary with which they should be having these conversations.
And do you think, and also not to stereotype, by the way, because I think your book does a great job of showing that African Americans are not all people at the same economic level. There's a really interesting complexion to the varied African American characters in your book. But do you think that the conversation have you ever had a conversation across racial and economic lines that's as honest as that paragraph you just read?
No, which is why I have him think the paragraph as opposed to say it. In the first draft, I had a series of conversations that, when I read over, felt like artificial unburdenings. People saying what they really thought to other people saying what they really thought, and it felt fraudulent after I took a step back and read it over. What I did then was I took a lot of these thoughts and these combination of stereotypes and apt observations, and when people were at their most charged moments, I felt comfortable inserting that into some of the conversation. But otherwise, most of those were silent thoughts that people maybe don't even know they're ashamed to have, but know that in polite company, you don't discuss the fact that the kids in this neighborhood are eating a bag of chips on the way to school and you judge their parents for that, because you don't know how to talk about that or what that means. So I tried to walk a line between sort of demonstrating enough self-knowledge in these characters so they wouldn't be despicable, but enough naivete to have them feel like they weren't saviors, that they were sort of messy and doing things wrong as often as they were doing things right.
So your main characters, Aaron and Amelia, young couple, upwardly mobile, they've bought this brownstone because nobody in New York can ever forget a real estate price. I believe it's $1.35 million is what they paid for the brownstone.
More than what we paid.
And what I want to ask is what you think of those two people you wrote, because they would probably call themselves nice people, but they're pretty flawed. And what I thought was interesting is that in the course of the book, they each commit the sin of really taking advantage of other people. Aaron is a rabbi whose career ended in disgrace because he has a gambling problem, and he basically took advantage of the synagogue's finances. You could even say he stole from the synagogue in a really inappropriate way. And Amelia, I don't want to ruin any of this very tense, readable plot. But Amelia, towards the end of the book, arguably takes advantage of somebody else in a really interesting way, and also gets called out for it, what we would think would be a really painful way. So anyway, what do you think of these two people who kind of dominate the book, and how did you end up writing this theme of them taking advantage of other people?
My agent is gonna laugh at me when I say this. Trina Keating, the best agent in the United States, is gonna laugh at me when I say this, because I've always had a complicated relationship with likability. People who struggle reading my work, I think struggle sometimes because there isn't a simple hero, especially in a world of complicated racial inequality. Like, you make the white guy a hero, and like, what are you trying to say there? But like, you make the African American a sort of heroic figure, and like, that seems patronizing and false. It all comes down to something I believe and have been told not to talk about too much out loud, but that I think we're all really selfish. The people I love most are really, really selfish. I care, except for my wife, who is not. My mom, I guess. I can go through the crowd. Right. Actually, my wife and mom are. My sister happens not to be. She happens to be the exception. But like, all I care about are my kids and my wife and I guess my sister, mom, and dad, and like my close friends. After they're okay. Like, I love you all, and I mean it when I say I am sincerely and profoundly touched that you'd all be here. But like, we all know what drives people. It's to try to figure out how to like live a life that's endurable, and to like give love to the people they love, and to try to expand the number of people they love, and to show them love too. And like, beyond that, we try. It's better to do good than to do bad. But I wanted my characters to be recognizably selfish and human. And I think that I'm harder, maybe a little bit, on Aaron and Amelia than some of the other characters, because it's like kind of obnoxious to move into a historically black neighborhood and live in one of the most beautiful buildings there, and to just assume it's all going to be okay. And the decisions they make are at times far more selfish than decisions Alex would ever make, and I probably would ever make. But they're not out of the realm of like seeing a situation, being terrified, and acting for their own best interest and the best interest of their kid. And one of the checks on myself as I was writing this for not creating stereotypical characters was I wanted to make sure that everything that everybody did, they did because it would make them happier, or they thought it would. To me, that was a way to avoid the trap of the overly pure minority character, or the sort of villain for the sake of villainy. I tried to put all these people in situations, have the world explode, and then have them try to act best they could to get through the day.
Okay, simple yes or no question, and then I'll tell you why I'm asking. Did you write this book in your physical house?
Yes.
Okay, so that is really intense, right? You've written this book about your neighborhood, about Bed-Stuy, and it's set in this house that, again, is kind of like a character.
Oh, it's the same house. The book is set in the house where I live.
Right.
The people are different, but it's
right. So the book is kind of about your house, right? And you're sitting there writing it in your house. And we all know what writing is like, right? You can only write for so many hours at once. You're getting up, you have to stretch, you get a snack, you have to distract yourself, et cetera, et cetera. Tell us about what it was like to sit there day after day and write literally a book about your own house.
Easier, I think. It was, I tried to keep myself in the mindset where, like, what room would my worst self run into under these circumstances? Or where would this act of violence actually occur? And then I described it, and I went down to make sure it looked like it actually looks in my house. Part of the inspiration for the house as character comes from the fact that I still am, like, in awe that we get to live in this place, that was built in the 1890s and that had generations of very different from one another and very complicated people live in it. And I felt it was important to make it come alive, not just for the history, but to make the acts more grounded and believable, because there are some extreme things that happen plot-wise in the book, and I felt that if I grounded the house with real details about stained glass and woodwork on a real street in a real neighborhood, then some of the more extreme moments might seem believable, might seem less extreme.
So when we're done tonight, and after you've said hi to every single one of your friends and family here, you and Alex are going to go home to that same house. And
I hope.
How do you think your relationship to your house and to the neighborhood changed through the writing of this book? And how do you think it could further change now that the book is actually out and even strangers get to read it?
Well, Alex gives it a 5% chance that we're going to need to move. I think that that's slightly high. I think that I try to portray all the individuals in as honest and generous a way as I can. Admittedly, I'm scared of some rooms of my house now, and I try not to show that fear in front of my children. But it is like, it's what I'm thinking about anyway, is the honest answer. Like, I spent years thinking about this crazy place I'm living on, the house itself, I mean, like in this historically and currently dynamic block, and I just wrote my obsessions into the book. I hope it becomes less noticeable. That's the hope, that these issues become less objects of obsession and calmer and kinder and easier. I don't see that happening, though. This was my way of trying to come to terms with a lot of really complicated thoughts that I've been living with for the last 5, 6, 7 years.
What do you think you learned about gentrification that you didn't know at the start of the process, whether through one of those interviews or just through, like, sort of working through the issues in your own mind?
I also felt the need to sort of read deeply into the academic and popular history of the neighborhood and of gentrification, of different methodologies of policing and that world. And that was really enlightening to me. I didn't realize the extent to which the people gentrifying the first neighborhoods in Brooklyn that were gentrified were pretty much fit the exact same description as us. They were upwardly mobile white people who thought they discovered a new neighborhood. And being in that historical context made me feel way less comfortable about the whole thing, because as opposed to just somebody saying, like, what a cool house, let's live here, like, I saw my role as, I fit a type in a way that I hadn't fully understood before that. And I started thinking way more about the responsibilities of those of us who are complicating the lives of others, and how to...
What do you think those responsibilities are?
That is a very, very, very difficult question to answer in a satisfying way. The easy answer is to spend money in the local shops in the community and try to, be on the boards of libraries and schools and sort of the public institutions, try to buttress them and build them to the extent you can. I think the more complicated but similarly easy answer is meet as many people as you can and get to know them and hope they get to know you and have conversations. But that's not the real problem, right? The real problem is that we're forcing people to leave their homes and live places that they don't want to live anymore, and I have no idea how to solve that. The easy answer, and the slightly flippant one, is like, I wrote a book, so I hope more people will think about how complicated all of this is. But I thought about all the op-eds I could write, and I came up with zero. Like, anything I could say either sounded banal or like a total lie. I think that insofar as there's any value to this book beyond entertainment, it's that hopefully it is a bit of an exercise in empathy and will get people trying to think outside their frame of reference and force some of the thought that I forced myself into over the last few years.
It seemed to me reading it that what happens to each of these characters, meaning by the end of the book, was a really fraught series of choices for you. Because just to give you the complexion of the book, if you haven't read it, it's a multi-character narrative, and it's not written from one person's point of view or from an omniscient point of view. You're really in the heads of all of these different characters, and each of them is somehow transformed by the action of the book. There's a series of really dramatic and suspenseful events, and kind of who they are and what they're doing in the world really hangs in the balance for each of them. So the question of where each of them lands by the end of the book seems really important to me, right? Because people are going to read things into it. You are kind of making a statement, even if you're not trying to make a statement. So how did you, because you spent 7 years on this, that's a very long time, how did you figure out where you wanted each of them in the end? And I ask you to say that without actually giving away any of the endings.
Right. Most important to me is that it's not a moral judgment of these people. I didn't want people who did more good things to benefit and people who did more bad things to suffer. Because one, I don't think that's the way life works, and two, I think that there's a cleanliness to that which would be dissatisfying to a reader. What I did want, though, is for a sense of inevitability to feel like a through line, that people's actions in the beginning lead to direct consequences to the end. So my check on myself for that was reading through the novel. I wanted to make sure that sort of incidental decisions early on, or or the ways I introduced characters, for example, would come back later with repercussions that maybe the reader and the characters themselves hadn't anticipated. So for me, I wanted the book to feel like a cohesive whole, and that was more my goal than to pass judgment on any of my characters. That, like, I put them in this situation, I did my best to figure out how they would react honestly, and then interweaving everyone together, I tried to play out everyone's decisions and see where they'd land.
Okay, so speaking of the ending of the book, I'm just curious, so we can sort of set the stage for the questions. How many people in the room have read the book? Raise your hand if you've read this book already. Okay, that's a pretty substantial number, actually, for a first book event. So why don't we move to questions? I will try to call on everybody.
And obviously
we'll take
questions
as
from
many as we
people who
can.
have read it and from people who haven't. Eager to hear from anybody and everybody.
Go ahead.
So you talk about the book
There you go.
Thank you. You talk about the book, the house as a character in the book, essentially, and you talk about things that are currently in your house, or stained glass windows or something about that. But did you do any research on the prior occupants of the house and how that might have formed the character of the house?
Absolutely. So we got as far back as 3 owners, I think, before us, which took us into the 40s or something like that. And what I discovered wasn't news to the other people on the block, some of whom have lived there for 80 years. But we're in this neighborhood that's pretentiously called Stuyvesant Heights, partially by real estate agents, but partially because this was the neighborhood that a lot of the more upwardly mobile and successful African-American, initially African-American gentrifiers from when the neighborhood was all white, but then sort of lawyers and doctors. Like our house, for example, we found out is right now we're in the duplex in the middle and we rent out the top floor and the bottom floor to pay the mortgage. But a few owners ago, our house was a doctor's office, and the doctor and his family lived above and saw patients on the ground floor. The house next door was a lawyer's office and sort of a similar setup. So there's a pride which I think made people even more skeptical of our moving there initially, in that like these series of blocks were where African Americans who have made it put down familial and cultural roots, and sort of our series of blocks are in many ways a point of pride for the last few generations, which I say is both a lovely thing and a complicated thing.
Next question, come on. There you go.
I assume your neighbors knew that you're a writer. Did they know you were writing this book? And if so, what were some of the reactions, or what did they say to you about it?
For the most part, they think it's really cool and ask me when I'm going to be on TV. After I tell them I will never be on TV, they ask questions, the purpose of which is clearly to figure out if they are the main characters in the book, but they pretend it's not. So it's like, so.
Well, wait a second. Have they read it?
One has and was very positive about it, but who knows, right? Like they're my friends, and unless it's a real disaster, they're not going to tell me.
What's the etiquette of that? Do you like wrap up copies of the galleys and give them to your neighbors, and you're like, FYI, I kind of wrote this book about our block?
I went to my. This is something I thought too much about. I went to the neighbors that I knew would be in favor of this, regardless, first. And I told them that I needed their help figuring out some elements of how to handle things, and then asked them to tell the people who maybe wouldn't be as excited about it. And then I went to other people and told them that the book was actually about those first neighbors who were my friends who were spreading the word. So mostly a lot of deceit. These are real friends of ours. Like there are 6 houses on our little block, and all but one, come to our kids' birthday parties, and we go to barbecues out and back, and they mock me lovingly, and I think are eager to see if I have it in me to mock them back. I like if this book came out 5 years ago, I don't know what I would have done. I would have gone on some apology tour or something about I didn't mean to use the lives of people in this neighborhood for my own benefit. There's still some of that, clearly, for people who don't know me, but for the ones I really care about who do, they've been excited that there's going to be a book about the neighborhood and that I'm going to go be somebody special.
Well, the real test may be whether it provokes interesting conversations you wouldn't have had before.
For sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, next question. Come on. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, Dan.
So 2 questions. One, short one, being a sports fan, how did scheduling this on the night of the All-Star game?
Thought it was perfect, right? You saw the home run derby last night. It no longer defines who gets World Series home field. I thought I did it exactly for you. And actually, Mike Francesa has a cameo in the book. So you'll see him treat people poorly over the radio.
Oh, okay. As usual. The real question is, how did you struggle with the issue of intentionality versus outcomes? People's good intentions that they might have toward versus what ends up actually happening?
It's a great question. And one of the takeaways that I wanted people to get from the book was that outcomes are only partially defined by the person whose life experiences that outcome, which is why I felt it was important to have Police Commissioner Bratton in the book as a sort of character who was pulling strings above everybody else, because there's our intentions that I spoke a little bit malevolently about earlier, but there's also luck, and more than that, there are these greater forces in play that I learned a whole lot more about while writing the book. And people suffer from those forces in the book in a way that I feel is true to life, and that I wanted to definitely make clear that even people with good intentions don't necessarily end up following the path that they've set out hoping to follow.
Come on. Do I hear one or two more? Go ahead, ma'am.
How did you know when you were finished with the book?
When my agent told me I was allowed to submit it now, that the horrible problems in it were mostly cleared up and that we could show our face in the submission process. I mean, the question, the harder question is how did I decide it was ready to show Trina? And the answer to that is, like, I printed it out once and I had 1 million edits, and then I printed it out again and I had 1,000 edits, and then I printed it out again, and eventually I didn't want to print it out anymore. And I thought, this is as close as I'm gonna get. But I still, while I was reading today, I marked up I changed words and moved around a misplaced modifier, and I think that will never, ever, ever end. So I just have to stop printing it out and reading it is the moral of that story.
Next book.
Exactly.
Sir, in the front.
Rabbi Math asks a great question. It's about why I chose to make one of the principal characters a rabbi who ends up losing his job. And the answer is because I've spent the last 25 to 30 years thinking a lot about Rabbi Math. I have a complicated relationship with Judaism and complicated memories about the Jewish leaders in my life. Rabbi Math has meant by far more to me than any rabbi I have interacted with since, and they all scold me afterwards. They preempt my criticism of sermons and speeches by rabbis on the high holy days now, because they know that I'll feel it doesn't live up to Rabbi Math standards, not only of being articulate, but being kind and generous. But the truth is, one day Rabbi Math disappeared, and he wasn't there anymore, and the stories were mysterious and complicated and confusing. And I'd always wondered about that and thought a lot about that, and I didn't have the guts to contact you while I was writing the book, because I was scared about what you would say or what you would think about the project. But I as important to me as thinking through the repercussions of living in this neighborhood was thinking through the repercussions of a religious figure whom I really looked up to and whom I lost track of. And when you were kind enough to chat with me after I knew I wasn't allowed to change anything anymore, no matter what happened in our conversation, I was so happy to see you as a wonderful, flawed human being in the way that we're all wonderful and flawed, and that speaks not only to my hopes about who we all are, but the path that the novel's protagonist took. But the answer is I couldn't get you out of my mind.
Sir in the blue shirt.
It says on. I'm a slow reader, so when's the movie coming out?
I think we have someone in the room who's currently working on that. The book isn't available in audio form, and you are not a slow reader, but I appreciate the call out. Yeah, that'd be cool. I'd be into that. We can all read it now and then judge the film for not being as good as the movie and all of our fantasies. But I decided that all I've ever wanted in life is like a couple friends and a perfect family. And then like after that, like if I could get a novel across the finish line, I'd be the happiest man in the world. So like I'm quitting. Like if I get a movie, great, but I've done everything I've ever imagined possible I'd be able to do.
Yeah, you're done.
I'm hanging it up. By hanging it up, I definitely mean anxiously writing the next book every day of this week and all week's future. Sarah, my editor, But we'll for the rest of the evening, I'll be hanging it up.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. If anybody, there you go.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, Megan.
I have a good last question, I think. Did you, in the process of writing this, are we going to see as we read it the seeds for the next project? Or are you going to turn to something completely different next because you've just gotten it all out?
That is a great question. The next project is going to be about something entirely different. It's going to be different characters dealing with different issues. But I do want to keep that same sense of how people's lives are driven both by their joys and sufferings and by forces that are far out of their control. So I'm trying to create a whole new universe and a whole new set of characters while keeping in mind that sense of trying to prioritize the political reality, especially today's political reality, and an attempt at empathy, at making all this come together so it's tons of fun to read and maybe you walk away thinking something different.
Well, Brian Platzer, here is to you and your novel. Happy publication date.
Thank you, and a louder round of applause, please, for Jody, who did me an honor of hanging out with us tonight.